When the Roman soldiers nailed the inscription to the cross, they wrote Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. 3 languages, 1 identification. The town was part of his name, inseparable from his identity even in the moment of his execution. It had been part of how people addressed him throughout his ministry, how his enemies identified him, how his disciples referred to him, of Nazareth, from Nazareth, the Nazarene. The town that gave him its name was, by any standard, the ancient world applied to measure significance, a place that should have produced nothing anyone remembered. No strategic position, no famous history, no notable institution, not a crossroads, not a capital, not even, according to most of the ancient sources, worth mentioning in a list of Galilean towns. The Nazareth was the kind of place that the census counted and the historians ignored. And yet, what Nazareth produced, what the specific economic, social, and physical conditions of this particular village in the hills of Lower Galilee produced, shaped everything that the man who carried its name said and did and understood about the world. The parables that would eventually be heard in every language on earth drew their material from the working life of this village. The authority with which he spoke about debt, about landowners and tenant farmers, about workers hired at dawn and workers hired at the 11th hour, about masters and servants and the specific quality of suffering that comes from having no margin left. That authority came from 30 years of direct observation in one specific place. To understand what Nazareth produced, you first have to understand what Nazareth was, not what it has become in the devotional imagination. The peaceful village of the Holy Family, bathed in the golden light of religious painting. What it actually was, a working community in a taxed landscape, embedded in a regional economy that reached from the highlands of Galilee down to the Sea of Galilee and across to the Hellenistic cities, being built with the labor of its craftsmen. A place where money moved in specific directions along specific channels from the people who earned it toward the institutions that claimed it. That is what we are examining today, not the theology, not the sacred narrative, the economy. How people in Nazareth made money, how much of it they got to keep, what the structures were that governed the movement of resources through the village and away from it, and why understanding all of that makes the ministry that began there and later returned there to be rejected, legible in ways it cannot be without it. The regional frame, Galilee under Herod. Antipas Nazareth did not exist in isolation. It existed within the political and economic structure of Galilee as governed by Herod Antipas, who held the territory from 4 BCE until 39 CE, the entire period of Jesus' life in the village and his subsequent ministry. Understanding Antipas's Galilee is the first step toward understanding Nazareth's economy, because Antipas's priorities determined the tax structure, the labor demands, and the commercial landscape within which every family and every village in his territory was operating. Antipas was a builder. Like his father Herod the Great, he expressed his power and his relationship with Rome through construction. His 2 major projects were the reconstruction of Sepphoris as his initial capital, undertaken in the years of Jesus' childhood and adolescence, and the founding of Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, begun around 20 CE. Both projects required enormous quantities of stone, timber, skilled craftsmen, unskilled laborers, administrators, and the tax revenues to pay for all of it. The tax revenues came from the agricultural population of Galilee, from the farmers, the olive growers, the vine growers, and the fishing communities of the lake shore, who collectively produced the surplus that Antipas required to fund his ambitions. The rate of Antipas's extraction is debated among historians, but the general picture from ancient sources is consistent. The Galilean peasantry was taxed heavily. The revenues flowed toward the administrative centers at Sepphoris and Tiberias, and the margin available for accumulation at the village level was thin to non-existent. This is the macroeconomic context of Nazareth, a village in a territory governed by a client king whose primary economic activity was extracting resources from rural producers to fund urban construction projects that expressed his relationship with Rome. The villages of Galilee were, in this framework, the economic base that supported the superstructure of Hellenistic city building. They produced the labor, the agricultural surplus, and the tax revenues that made Sepphoris and Tiberias possible. Nazareth was one of those villages, and its proximity to Sepphoris, 6 kilometers, approximately 1 hour on foot, made its relationship to Antipas's building economy more immediate than that of villages further from the capital. The labor demands that Antipas's construction projects placed on Galilee's villages were not only economic, they were also social and political. A craftsman from Nazareth who worked at Sepphoris for months at a time was a craftsman whose household was managing without him, whose agricultural holdings required someone else's attention, whose children were growing up with a father who was present only intermittently. The construction economy that Antipas's ambitions required was an economy that absorbed the productive capacity of rural men in ways that disrupted the agricultural base those men were also responsible for maintaining. The village that provided labor to the city was a village that was, in a precise sense, subsidizing the city's ambitions with its own domestic stability. The first layer of Nazareth's economic story, then, is this: a small agricultural community in a taxed landscape, providing labor and resources to a construction economy it did not control, governed by rules it had not made, for purposes that served interests other than its own. This is not unusual in the ancient world. It is, in fact, the standard condition of rural communities under imperial or quasi-imperial administration throughout history. What makes Nazareth specific is the intersection of that standard condition with the specific individuals and events that the village produced, the town itself. What Nazareth had and what it lacked. Nazareth in the first century was small. The archaeological evidence, limited but consistent, points to a population of between 200 and 400 people. This was not a market town, not a junction town, not a center of any regional function. It was a village that existed for the people who lived in it and for the agricultural territory immediately around it. The physical landscape of the village was shaped by its geology and its water supply. Nazareth sat in a bowl-shaped depression in the limestone hills of Lower Galilee, at approximately 350 meters above sea level. The bowl offered some shelter from the wind and, more importantly, it contained a spring, the only reliable water source for permanent settlement in the immediate area. The spring still flows today, venerated as Mary's Well, and it was the organizing center of the village's daily life in the first century, the point around which the rhythm of water collection, and with it the rhythm of social interaction, revolved. The houses of Nazareth were built from the local limestone, cut from the hillside or gathered from the fields. They clustered around shared courtyards with extended families occupying the rooms around each courtyard. The rooms were small and dark. The roofs were flat, constructed of wooden beams covered with branches, reeds, and packed clay. The animals shared the lower level of the structure in winter. The grinding stone for grain was in the courtyard. The clay oven for bread was in the courtyard. The entire productive and social life of the household happened in and around that shared space. What Nazareth lacked is as economically significant as what it had. It lacked a market. There is no evidence of a regular market at Nazareth itself in the first century. The nearest significant market was at Sepphoris, 6 kilometers away, where the commercial life of a Hellenistic city of perhaps 8,000 to 12,000 people concentrated buying, selling, and exchange. Nazareth's producers who wanted to sell their agricultural surplus, their olive oil, their grain, their wine, had to carry it to Sepphoris, or wait for itinerant merchants to come to them. The absence of a local market meant that the terms of trade were consistently determined at Sepphoris, not at Nazareth. Nazareth also lacked a road of significance. The main road network of Galilee connected Sepphoris to Tiberias, and the Via Maris ran through the Jezreel Valley to the south. Nazareth sat off these routes, accessible by local paths but not on the axis of regional commerce. This meant that the traffic-driven commercial activity that sustained villages on significant roads, the hospitality trade, the toll revenues, the incidental commerce of travelers, was largely absent from Nazareth's economy. What the village produced, it had to carry elsewhere to sell. The agriculture, olives, grain, and the vine. The economic life of Nazareth's farming families was organized around three primary crops: olives, grain, and grapes. Each had its own seasonal rhythm, its own capital requirements, and its own relationship to the market and the tax system. Together they formed the interlocking agricultural economy that sustained the village. The olive orchards on the slopes around Nazareth were the village's most valuable long-term asset. An olive tree in the limestone soils of Lower Galilee takes up to 10 years to reach its first significant harvest and then produces for centuries. The trees that Nazareth's families tended in the first century had been planted by their grandparents or great-grandparents. They were not investments in the modern sense. They were inherited relationships with the land, living capital accumulated across generations, producing oil that served cooking, lighting, medicine, and ritual anointing, and that was valuable enough to be a standard medium of payment and regional export. The olive harvest in autumn required collective labor beyond what most individual households could supply. Beating the branches, collecting the fallen olives on spread cloth, carrying the harvest to the communal stone press, managing the pressing operation. All of this was work that the village did together, coordinating labor across family lines in patterns of mutual obligation that had their own social and economic logic. The oil that emerged from the press was divided according to those obligations and then stored or sold. Families that produced more than they needed for domestic use sold the surplus, either directly to merchants who came to the village or by carrying it to Sepphoris. Grain, wheat, and barley was the other pillar of the village's food security. Grown in the small flat areas and the terraced hillsides around the village, harvested in spring, stored in large clay jars or stone-cut chambers. Grain provided the flour for the daily bread that was the base of every meal. The thin soils and variable rainfall of the Nazareth area made grain cultivation less reliable than olive cultivation. A dry winter could significantly reduce a harvest. A hailstorm at the wrong moment could destroy one entirely. This variability was the primary driver of the debt cycle that threatened agricultural families throughout the region. A bad harvest year required borrowing, the loan was secured against the land, and the land moved toward the creditor if the debt was not serviced. The vineyards on the better exposed slopes of the hills around Nazareth completed the agricultural trio. Established over 4 years before first significant yield, producing grapes that were eaten fresh, dried as raisins, or pressed for wine. The vineyards required seasonal labor, pruning in late winter, careful management through the growing season, harvesting in late summer, and communal pressing infrastructure. Wine was both a household staple and a tradable commodity, and the quality of the local vintage determined the price it commanded at Sepphoris or with passing merchants. The terracing that made hillside farming possible was itself an economic investment and a form of collective memory. The stone walls that retained the soil on the slopes around Nazareth had been built by previous generations, maintained by the current one, and were expected to be passed on to the next. A terrace wall that collapsed after heavy winter rain required immediate repair. The soil that had accumulated in the terrace over decades would wash away if the retaining wall was not rebuilt quickly. The labor of terrace maintenance was continuous and collective. A village that allowed its terracing to deteriorate was a village that was progressively losing its agricultural base. Nazareth's terraces were not infrastructure provided by some external authority. They were the accumulated investment of generations, built and maintained by the families who depended on them. The relationship between these three crops and the tax system was the central economic tension of Nazareth's agricultural life. Rome taxed grain and oil directly, assessing the tax against production and requiring payment in cash. The temple required tithes, 10% of grain and oil and wine to the Levites, a second tithe for consumption in Jerusalem during festival weeks, and in certain years a third tithe for the poor. The aggregate extraction could reach 30 to 40% of annual production. A burden that, on a subsistence margin, was the mechanism by which bad harvest years became debt years, and debt years became the years in which land transferred from families to creditors. The tekton, Joseph's trade and what it connected Nazareth to the Greek word that the Gospels use to describe Joseph's occupation is tekton. It has been translated almost universally as carpenter. The translation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. A tekton in the first century Greek-speaking world was a craftsman who worked in both wood and stone. A builder in the broader sense, someone who could frame a roof, hang a door, construct furniture, cut and dress limestone, and manage the range of structural tasks that building and maintenance of the physical environment required. In Nazareth, with its limited local market and its proximity to the major construction project at Sepphoris, being a tekton was not primarily about serving the domestic repair needs of a village of 300 people. It was about access to the labor market that Antipas's building ambitions had created in the city 6 kilometers away. A tekton who could work in stone as well as wood, who could cut limestone to specification and fit it into a coursed wall, who understood the structural requirements of Roman-style construction, that craftsmen had skills that the Sepphoris building site needed continuously, and that the wages paid there were in cash rather than in agricultural produce. The significance of the cash wage cannot be overstated in the context of Nazareth's economy. Agricultural income came in seasonal bursts, at the grain harvest, at the olive pressing, at the grape harvest, and largely in kind: grain, oil, wine, which then had to be sold to generate the cash required for tax payments. A craftsman who worked in Sepphoris received daily wages in denarii. Those denarii could pay taxes directly without the intermediate step of selling agricultural produce at market prices the seller did not control. The cash income was a form of economic security that the purely agricultural family did not have, and it gave Joseph's household a structural advantage over households dependent entirely on the harvest. The specific skills that made Joseph a viable worker at Sepphoris were also skills with a domestic application in Nazareth itself. The village's houses required maintenance, doors that needed hanging, roofs that needed repair after winter damage, furniture that needed making or fixing, agricultural equipment, plows, yokes, threshing boards that needed fabrication or replacement. A tekton served the village's domestic repair economy as well as the city's construction economy, and the two sources of income were complementary. The city work provided the cash income required for tax payments, while the village work sustained the relationships of mutual obligation and service that were the social fabric of the community. A craftsman who was available to his neighbors was a craftsman who could count on his neighbors when he needed them. The daily commute from Nazareth to Sepphoris and back approximately 1 hour each way on foot, was not unusual in the ancient world for craftsmen working in a city economy. It meant, however, that Joseph and any sons old enough to work were spending their working days in a Hellenistic city that was in every way the opposite of their home village. Sepphoris had a Roman-style theater, colonnaded streets, houses with mosaic floors, public baths, and a sophisticated water system. It heard Greek spoken alongside Aramaic. It was being built to announce Antipas's modernity to the Roman world. And it was built by craftsmen from the surrounding villages, including Nazareth, who went home each evening to limestone houses with clay floors. Jesus, in this framework, almost certainly worked at Sepphoris from his early adolescence. The Gospels describe him at 12 as already having a relationship with teachers and texts that went beyond what village schooling would have produced. The years between 12 and 30 are silent in the Gospel accounts, but the economic logic of a tekton's household in Nazareth, 6 kilometers from the largest construction project in Galilee, makes it highly probable that those years were years of daily contact with the Hellenistic world being built just over the hill, with its languages, its architecture, its economic stratification made visible in stone, and its specific and daily demonstration of who commissioned buildings and who built them. This daily exposure was not incidental to what Jesus later taught. The man who spoke with precision about masters and servants, about the specific quality of working for someone else's benefit, with inadequate recognition, about the dignity of labor and the indignity of its exploitation, was not speaking from abstract principle. He was speaking from the accumulated experience of a craftsman's household that had spent decades producing the physical fabric of a city it could not afford to live in. The stone vessel industry, purity, commerce, and craft, one of the most archaeologically documented craft industries in first-century Galilee, is one that most accounts of the period entirely overlook. The production of stone vessels for ritual hand-washing. Excavations at sites throughout the Galilee region, including the vicinity of Nazareth, have recovered these vessels in extraordinary numbers. Small cups, bowls, and larger storage jars carved from the soft local limestone in specific forms designed to serve the ritual washing requirements of Jewish purity law. The theological basis for the industry was specific. Jewish purity law distinguished between vessels that could and could not contract ritual impurity. Clay vessels, once they became ritually impure, had to be broken and discarded. They could not be purified by washing. Stone vessels, by contrast, were considered incapable of contracting ritual impurity. They could always be purified by rinsing. This made them the preferred choice for the ritual hand-washing before meals that Jewish observance required, and for the storage of food and water in households that maintained high standards of purity observance. The soft limestone of the Galilee region, the same chalk limestone that underlay Nazareth's hills, was ideal for this craft. It could be worked with relatively simple iron tools, a chisel to rough out the form, a drill to open the interior, scrapers and abrasives to finish the surface. A skilled craftsman could produce several cups in a day. The finished vessels were not decorative objects. They were functional commodities with a guaranteed market in any observant Jewish household throughout the region. The connection between this industry and a tekton's household in Nazareth is more than circumstantial. Joseph's craft, working in stone as well as wood, included exactly the skills required for stone vessel production. A workshop that could cut and dress limestone for construction could also produce the smaller stone objects that the purity economy required. The stone vessel industry and the construction industry used overlapping skill sets and overlapping raw materials, and both were present in the Nazareth area. Whether Joseph's household produced stone vessels as a secondary commercial activity is not documented, but the economic logic is straightforward. A craftsman with stoneworking skills in a village with access to appropriate limestone, within a region with a guaranteed market for purity vessels, in every Jewish household, had both the means and the incentive to produce them. The industry that the archaeology documents in such abundance throughout Galilee had to be produced somewhere, by craftsmen with specific skills. Nazareth, with its limestone geology and its tecton households, was exactly the kind of place that would have contributed to that production. The stone vessel industry also illustrates something important about how the purity economy and the market economy intersected in first-century Galilee. Religious obligation created commercial demand. The requirement to maintain ritual purity was a religious requirement, backed by the authority of the Torah and the social pressure of community observance. But fulfilling that requirement required purchasing objects that craftsmen produced for sale. The sacred and the commercial were, in this as in so many other aspects of first-century Jewish life, structurally inseparable. The Sepphoris connection, what working there actually meant. The 6-kilometer distance between Nazareth and Sepphoris was one of the defining economic facts of the village's first-century life, and it deserves more examination than it usually receives, because what the daily commute to Sepphoris meant for Nazareth's craftsmen was not simply access to better wages. It was daily immersion in a world that was, in almost every respect, the opposite of the world they went home to each evening. Sepphoris, in the years of Jesus' childhood and adolescence, was a city under active construction. Antipas was rebuilding it as a showcase capital, the jewel of Galilee, as he reportedly called it. The theater, which could seat several thousand, was being constructed in the Roman style, with tiered seating and a decorated stage backdrop. The streets were being laid out on a Roman grid. Houses for the city's wealthy residents were being built with the architectural vocabulary of the Hellenistic Roman world. Colonnaded facades, mosaic floors, frescoed walls, private bath chambers. The water system was being engineered to bring clean water into the city from distant springs through underground channels. The craftsmen who built all of this were primarily from the villages of the surrounding area, including Nazareth. They worked under the direction of architects and master builders who understood Roman construction methods, and they learned those methods through practice. A stone cutter from Nazareth who spent several seasons working on Sepphoris's construction projects acquired knowledge of Roman architectural forms, of Hellenistic decorative vocabulary, of the engineering principles that governed arch construction and water management, that he would not have encountered in the village. He also encountered daily the people who were commissioning the construction, Antipas's court, the wealthy merchants who were building houses in the new city, the priestly families who were establishing themselves in Galilee's new administrative center. These were the people whose economic decisions shaped the landscape the craftsmen from Nazareth were working in. They were visible, concrete, nameable. Their wealth was not abstract. It was the difference between the houses they were having built and the houses the builders went home to. The Jesus who spoke about masters and servants with such precision, who described so accurately the specific dynamics of working for people with power over your livelihood and your time, who understood so clearly the psychology of the man who owes everything to someone whose generosity or cruelty determines his survival, that Jesus had spent years working in exactly that relationship. The theological insight and the economic observation were, in his case, the same thing. He had watched it every working day for the formative years of his adult life. Sepphoris also connected the craftsmen from Nazareth to the wider Hellenistic world in ways that the village itself could not. The theater at Sepphoris, which some scholars have connected to Jesus' use of the word hypocrite, which in Greek means actor, one who plays a role, staged Greek and Roman dramatic productions. Whether Jesus attended the theater is unknown and probably unanswerable, but the craftsmen who built the theater, who installed its seating and fitted its stage, would have been present during rehearsals and performances if the construction calendar overlapped with the theatrical season. The cultural exposure that Sepphoris provided to the working people of the surrounding villages was not incidental to the intellectual formation of the people who grew up commuting to it. The debt system. How Nazareth lost. What it made of all the economic structures that shaped life in Nazareth. None was more consequential than the debt system that connected the village to Jerusalem and to the wider network of capital that operated out of Galilee's cities. Understanding the debt system is essential to understanding what Jesus taught, because his teaching about debt, and he taught about it constantly in parable after parable, in direct statement and indirect reference, was not abstract theology, it was economic description. The mechanism was straightforward in structure and devastating in effect. Agricultural families in Nazareth operated on a margin that left nothing for accumulation. In a good year, they produced enough to eat, to pay their tax obligations, to set aside seed for the next planting, and perhaps to sell a small surplus. In a bad year, and bad years came with enough regularity that the entire agricultural system was built around anticipating them, they did not produce enough. The gap had to be filled. The only way to fill it was to borrow. Loans in the first century Galilean economy were not institutional in the modern sense. There were no banks, no credit unions, no regulated lenders with published interest rates. Loans were personal transactions between individuals or families with different levels of capital. The craftsman in the city who had accumulated savings, the merchant who had liquidity from his trading operations, the priestly family in Jerusalem whose institutional income gave them surplus to deploy. The borrower was the farming family that had run out of grain before the next harvest. The collateral was the land. Jewish law prohibited lending at interest between Jews, but the prohibition was extensively circumvented by legal instruments that the first century had developed. The prosbul, attributed to the Pharisaic teacher Hillel, allowed creditors to transfer their loans to a court before the sabbatical year, preventing the Torah's 7-year debt cancellation from applying. The practical effect was permanent debt, a loan secured against land with interest prohibited in name, but charged in effect through legal fictions that could not be canceled by the sabbatical year provision, was a loan that accumulated across bad harvest years until the land transferred. The land that transferred went to creditors who typically lived in Sepphoris, in Tiberias, or in Jerusalem, urban capital that was steadily acquiring rural land through the patient mechanism of lending into agricultural vulnerability. The family that had owned its olive orchard for 3 generations became tenants paying rent to an absentee landlord. The rent was assessed as a fraction of the harvest, typically 1/3 to 1/2, which meant that the family working the same trees it had once owned was now working for the benefit of an investor in the city who had never lifted an olive branch. The specific language that Jesus used for debt in the prayer he taught his disciples reflects the linguistic reality of the world he grew up in. The Aramaic word hoba carried both meanings simultaneously: financial debt and moral failing, the thing owed in the commercial sense and the thing owed in the religious sense. When the prayer asked God to forgive debts as we forgive our debtors, it was not using financial debt as a metaphor for moral failure. It was addressing both realities in the same word, because in the world Nazareth inhabited, the two were genuinely inseparable. The man who owed money he could not repay, and the man who had sinned and needed forgiveness were often the same man, experiencing the same crushing weight of an obligation he had no power to meet. The prayer that Nazareth's economy made necessary was also the prayer that its theology made central. This is the world of the parables. The absentee landlord who sends servants to collect the harvest rent from the tenant farmers and finally sends his son, and the tenants kill them all. The man who owes 10,000 talents to a king, an amount so vast it could never be repaid in a lifetime, who is forgiven the debt and immediately demands repayment of the 100 denarii owed to him by a fellow servant. The day laborer who comes to the marketplace at dawn, hoping someone will hire him, and again at the 3rd hour, and again at the 6th, and at the 11th hour is still there because no one has hired him. These are not invented figures. They are the people of Nazareth and its surrounding villages, described with the precision of someone who had watched the system operate on his neighbors throughout his childhood and adolescence. The parable of the prodigal son, told by Jesus and set in an agricultural context that every person listening would have recognized, turns on the specific mechanism of inheritance in a world of agricultural debt. The younger son asks for his share of the inheritance early, an unusual request that implies the family's land and assets are not encumbered by debt, that there is something to divide. He converts it to liquid capital, leaves, wastes it, and ends up feeding pigs for a Gentile farmer, the nadir of economic and religious degradation available in the Jewish world. He comes to himself and returns. The father runs to meet him. These details are not decorative. They are the specific notes of an agricultural economy that Jesus' audience lived in, described back to them with the authority of someone who understood it from the inside. The festival economy, 3 times a year. 3 times a year, the economic life of Nazareth was disrupted and supplemented by the same event, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Passover in spring, Shavuot 50 days later, Sukkot in autumn. Each required the journey of approximately 140 kilometers, 5 days on foot, the fulfillment of temple obligations upon arrival, the half-shekel tax, the purchase and sacrifice of animals, the consumption of the second tithe in the city, and the 5-day return journey. The pilgrimage was, in economic terms, an extraction event. The family that traveled to Jerusalem spent money it could not easily spare on the journey itself. Food for the road, accommodation or camping, fodder for any animals being brought for sacrifice, and spent money in Jerusalem on the temple obligations that were religiously mandatory. The half-shekel required currency exchange at the temple's monopoly money changers, at fees that added to the cost of the obligation itself. The sacrificial animal, if purchased inside the temple complex, cost significantly more than the same animal outside. The second tithe, which was supposed to be consumed in Jerusalem during the festival week, meant spending resources in the city on food and lodging that could otherwise have sustained the family at home. None of this was optional. The pilgrimage obligations were religious requirements, backed by the authority of the Torah and the social pressure of a community that observed together. A family that did not appear in Jerusalem for Passover was a family making a statement about its relationship to the covenant community, a statement that had social consequences in a village where community identity was inseparable from religious observance. The economic preparation for the pilgrimage began weeks before the journey. Families had to arrange for the care of their agricultural holdings in their absence, the olives that needed watching, the animals that needed feeding, the household that needed managing. They had to prepare food for the road and convert agricultural surplus into the cash or portable goods that would pay for what they needed in Jerusalem. They had to negotiate with neighbors who might watch their property and with relatives who might join the caravan for mutual safety. The logistics of the pilgrimage were themselves a form of economic activity, mobilizing resources and relationships in the weeks before departure in ways that generated their own small commercial transactions. But the pilgrimage also created commercial opportunities that partially offset its costs. The caravans that formed for the journey were organized at the village or regional level, and they created temporary mobile markets. Families sharing food, trading small items, providing services to each other along the way. Merchants who positioned themselves along the pilgrimage routes or in Jerusalem itself during festival weeks could capture revenue from the concentrated demand of hundreds of thousands of people in the same place at the same time. For Nazareth families with agricultural surplus to sell, olive oil, dried figs, wine, the pilgrimage season provided access to a concentrated market that the village's ordinary commercial isolation denied them. The pilgrimage also connected Nazareth's families to the wider world of Jewish commercial and social life in a way that their ordinary isolation prevented. The roads to Jerusalem were roads on which families from every part of Galilee, Judea, and the diaspora traveled together. Information moved along these roads. News of market conditions, of political developments, of religious debates, and of family connections that could be activated for commercial or social purposes. The annual journeys were not only religious events, they were the primary mechanism by which a family in an isolated Galilean village maintained its connections to the larger network that sustained Jewish life across the empire. Women's labor and the invisible economy. No account of how money moved in Nazareth can be complete without addressing the labor that made all other economic activity possible, but that the ancient world's formal categories of economic life did not count. The work of the village's women. The grinding of grain was the first economic act of every day in Nazareth. The daily bread that formed the base of every meal required flour, and flour required grinding. And grinding the grain for a family's daily needs took between 2 and 3 hours of continuous labor at the hand mill. 2 heavy circular stones, the upper fitted with a wooden handle, rotated over the lower while grain was fed through the hole in the center. This was not a task with a substitute. Every day, without exception, it had to be done. The women of Nazareth, from adolescence until old age, ground grain. The sound of the grinding stone was the sound of the morning in every household in the village. Beyond grinding, the baking of bread in the clay ovens of the courtyard, the management of the household's food stores, the careful calculation of how much grain remained, how many weeks until the next harvest, whether the family could afford to give hospitality to a traveler without compromising its own supply. The production of cloth, spinning the raw wool or flax, weaving on the upright loom that stood in the corner of the main room, producing the garments the family wore. The maintenance of the household garden, the small plot adjacent to the house that produced vegetables, herbs, and legumes that supplemented the agricultural staples. The care of the household's animals, chickens for eggs, a goat for milk, a donkey for transport. These activities were not considered economic in the ancient world's accounting. They generated no market transactions, produced no taxable revenue, created no record in any administrative system. They were simply what women did, as inevitable and as unremarkable as the seasons. And they were the foundation on which every other economic activity in the village rested. The grain farmer could farm because someone was processing what he harvested. The tecton could work at Sepphoris because someone was maintaining the household in his absence. The shepherd could be away with the flock because someone was managing the domestic economy he had left behind. The women of Nazareth also managed the village's medical knowledge. In the absence of physicians, there were none in a village of this size. The accumulated knowledge of medicinal plants, of preparations that reduced fever and cleaned wounds and eased difficult labors, was held by the older women of the community and transmitted to the younger ones through direct instruction and observation. This knowledge was economic in the precise sense that it reduced the cost of illness for families that could not afford to lose a working adult to sickness. Its value was not monetized. It was distributed through the networks of mutual obligation and care that made village life survivable. The economic vulnerability of women in Nazareth was not distributed equally across the life cycle. Young women in established households with fathers and brothers who could advocate for them had a degree of protection. Widows without adult sons were in the most precarious position available. Without a male relative of working age to represent their interests in legal and commercial matters, they were dependent on the community's willingness to honor the Torah's provisions for the protection of widows. Provisions that the same economic pressures that had stripped families of their land had also been gradually emptying of practical content. The figure of the widow who must keep returning to the unjust judge because no one else will enforce her rights, a figure that appears in one of Jesus's parables, was not a literary type. She was a social reality in Nazareth and in every village like it. Mary, the mother of Jesus, lived this economy for 30 years in Nazareth. She ground grain before dawn. She baked bread in the courtyard oven. She carried water from the spring. She wove the family's clothing. She managed the household's food supply through the variable harvests of the Galilean agricultural calendar. She knew every woman in the village, the condition of every household, the pressures on every family. When Jesus drew on the image of a woman who grinds grain as the background for a saying about the end of days, or described a woman searching her house by lamplight for a lost coin, he was not reaching for illustrations. He was describing the world he had watched his mother inhabit every day of his life. The synagogue economy, knowledge and its distribution. There is one more economic layer in Nazareth's story that is rarely examined: the economy of religious knowledge and the institution that housed it. The synagogue of Nazareth was not only a place of worship, it was the village's educational institution, its legal court for minor disputes, its public meeting space, and the building that gave the community its collective identity as a covenant people. The shazan, the synagogue attendant, served multiple functions simultaneously: caretaker of the building, administrator of the institution's affairs, and primary teacher of children in the village's basic literacy program. His income, such as it was, came from the community's support. A modest honorarium from the families whose children he taught, supplemented by whatever other income he could generate from his other skills. The Torah scrolls that the synagogue held were its most valuable physical asset. A Torah scroll in the first century was expensive. Months of a scribe's skilled labor, fine parchment, specialized ink, and was held in common by the community, rather than owned by any individual family. The scroll was Nazareth's most valuable communal possession, more expensive than any individual household's entire material inventory. Its existence depended on ongoing maintenance. Scrolls deteriorate, require checking against canonical texts, occasionally require rewriting. The scribe who could do this work was a figure of significant status and economic value in any community that had a synagogue. The more advanced religious education available in the synagogue, the study of Torah beyond basic literacy, the engagement with the prophetic texts, the development of interpretive skill, was not available to most of Nazareth's children. The agricultural economy's demand for children's labor from an early age, the cost of sustained education in terms of the lost labor the family was absorbing, and the limited availability of teachers beyond the basic level, all combined to make advanced Torah study a privilege of the few. The handful of boys in each generation who showed exceptional aptitude and whose families could absorb the cost, were the ones who might eventually go on to study with a recognized teacher and enter the world of serious religious scholarship. Jesus' engagement with the scriptures, as it appears in the gospel accounts, goes well beyond what the basic village education could have produced. He quotes accurately from across the full range of the Hebrew Bible. He interprets with an authority that his contemporaries distinguished sharply from the scribal style of citation and accumulation. Whether this depth came from exceptional native ability applied to the village curriculum, from study with a teacher not recorded in the sources, or from some combination, it was not what Nazareth's educational economy normally produced. When he returned to the village and read from the Isaiah scroll in the synagogue, his neighbors' bewilderment, "Where did this man get all this?" was the genuine response of a community that knew exactly what its educational system produced and recognized that this was something else. The synagogue's role in Nazareth's economy extended to a function that is rarely considered: dispute resolution. Minor commercial and civil disputes in first-century Jewish communities were adjudicated by local authorities operating under the framework of Jewish law rather than through Roman courts, a jurisdiction that Rome permitted as long as it did not involve capital punishment. The synagogue was the natural site for this adjudication, and the people who could interpret the law and apply it to commercial disputes, boundary disputes between fields, disagreements about contract terms, questions about inheritance, held a form of power that had direct economic consequences. The ability to get a fair hearing in a local dispute or to have an unfair ruling challenged depended on knowing the law and knowing who could be trusted to apply it. Jesus' repeated engagement with questions of legal interpretation, his sharp challenges to interpretations that disadvantaged the poor, his insistence that the spirit of the law took precedence over its letter. All of this was engagement with a system that determined, in practical terms, who won commercial disputes in villages like Nazareth. The economy of Nazareth, the olive orchards and the grain fields, the tecton's workshop and the daily commute to Sepphoris, the debt system and the pilgrimage obligations, the women grinding grain and managing households, the synagogue and its scrolls, formed a man. 30 years of that specific formation produced a specific person with specific knowledge, specific competencies, and a specific understanding of how the world worked and how it failed the people who worked hardest within it. The stone vessel industry that we have documented in the Galilee region connects to a broader pattern in Nazareth's economic life, the way that religious obligation and commercial production were structurally intertwined in first-century Jewish society. The vessels required for ritual purity observance had to be produced by someone. The animals required for temple sacrifice had to be raised by someone. The incense required for temple worship had to be processed by someone. The scrolls required for synagogue reading had to be written by someone. Each of these religious requirements was also a commercial demand, and each commercial demand sustained a specific craft or agricultural specialty in specific communities. Nazareth's economy was shaped not only by the Roman imperial system pressing down from above, but by the Jewish religious system's requirements pressing inward from all sides. Both systems extracted. Both systems also, in their own way, organized the productive life of the village. And then that man came back. The family workshop in Nazareth was not only a place of production, it was a place of apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship was economic as much as technical. A boy who learned to work stone and wood alongside his father learned the craft, but he also learned the commercial relationships that sustained it, how to negotiate a price with a client, how to assess whether a job was worth the time it would take, how to manage the relationship with the merchant, who supplied the iron tools that were too expensive to make locally. He learned, in short, the specific commercial intelligence of a skilled craftsman operating in a regional economy, intelligence that could not be gained from books because it existed in practice, in the accumulated experience of transactions conducted over years in specific markets with specific people. That commercial intelligence is visible throughout the teaching, in the precision of the economic scenarios the parables describe, in the accuracy of the social dynamics they capture, in the authority with which a man who had worked for wages all his adult life described what it meant to work for wages. He came back during his ministry with a reputation that had preceded him from Capernaum. He stood up in the synagogue, the same building where he had learned to read Torah as a child, and read from the Isaiah scroll, and declared that the text was fulfilled in their hearing. The initial response was positive. The community spoke well of him. They marveled at the gracious words coming from his mouth. And then, "Is not this Joseph's son?" The question was not hostile in its first form. It was the genuine cognitive dissonance of a community that understood its own economy perfectly. They knew what a tekton's household produced. They knew what the village's educational system generated. They knew what 30 years in this specific place, under these specific conditions, should have made of the boy who had grown up among them. What they were hearing from the man in front of them did not match the account. Jesus' response to their bewilderment was to push it into open conflict. No prophet is accepted in his hometown. He cited Elijah sent to a widow in Sidon, not to the widows of Israel. He cited Elisha healing Naaman the Syrian, not the lepers of Israel. The crowd, which had been marveling, rose up and drove him out of the village and brought him to the edge of the cliff above the town to throw him down. He passed through them and went away. He did not return to Nazareth in the gospel accounts. The village that had made him could not receive what it had made. The economy that had produced his knowledge of debt and labor and the specific suffering of the agricultural poor, the economy he would spend his ministry describing back to the people living inside it, could not recognize itself in the description. The olive orchards continued to be harvested. The grain fields continued to be plowed. The tekton's workshop continued to produce what Sepphoris required. The women continued to grind grain before dawn. The debts continued to accumulate. The land continued to move toward the creditors in the cities. The system that had formed him continued, exactly as before, as if what it had produced had never been there. Whether that is the tragedy of Nazareth or simply its truth is a question the account does not answer. It records what happened, the rejection, the departure, the continuation. What the departure and the continuation meant for Nazareth, for the ministry that went on without it, for the question of whether any economic system is capable of recognizing what it has produced when what it has produced turns to name it honestly. That question is left where Jesus left it, at the edge of a cliff above a village in the hills of Galilee, in the moment before he passed through and went away.